To dissect the week, I'm joined by Gideon Rosner from the Institute of Public Affairs and Ben Oquist from the Australia Institute. Thank you both for joining me this afternoon. We'll kick it off with the Integrity Bill. It is before Parliament. Ben, what do the amendments mean for unions?
Well, it is finally listed before the Parliament. It wasn't listed in the last Senate sitting week, and some people said the government would bring it on anyway when they had the numbers. And the fact that they've brought it on obviously means they've listed it, means they're more confident. They don't need both One Nation and Jackie Lambie and Centre Alliance to pass it. If they've got Centre Alliance in the bag, they just need One Nation or Jackie Lambie. And it's been surprisingly difficult for them to get the legislation through, which is kind of surprising. A lot of people said it's a more compliant Senate, and they've just outlined there they don't need all of that crossbench, they just need 3 of them. And I think the problem they're now running into this week is the big revelations out of Westpac and the multitude, the $23 million potential crimes being committed by Westpac there. And you saw Tony Burke argue this case very cogently this morning on Sky, where part of the argument against this legislation is there's not an equivalent test for corporations and banks. So on the one hand, we're going into a parliamentary week and the government's going to be prosecuting legislation to say unions should be deregistered, potentially on 3 paperwork errors. Meanwhile, banks aren't being deregistered. And there's 23 million potential crimes, $11 billion related to those crimes, from money laundering and covering up what might have been sex trafficking. So I think the government's running some big headwinds now, having not passed the legislation in the previous Senate sitting weeks. They've now got a whole new political dynamic to deal with, and that's somehow defending the idea that unions should be deregistered when they're doing paperwork errors, and the banks shouldn't be. They've got no big stick legislation. No one's talking about deregistering banks or breaking them up. So I think we're in for a very interesting political debate this week.
Yeah, when you put it like that, it does sound like a bit of a double standard, Ben. Gideon, why has this bill been so harshly criticised? Is it for those same reasons that we mentioned?
Well, look, it's partly for reasons about what the bill does, and partly because of the clout of the union movement and its fellow travellers. Look, I take Ben's points. I would, though, point out that union leaders are not bound by the same corporate governance standards in other ways as corporate Australia, so it does cut both ways. But the thing about this bill is, look, it's not as if union thuggery and all these things aren't an issue. Of course they are, but there are deeper problems with our industrial relations system than just what unions are doing. There's the fact, for example, that we have among the most generous, or in fact we have the highest minimum wage in the developed world, and that's before you consider the premium imposed by awards and enterprise bargaining agreements and all sorts of other things. Now that's great if you have a job, but there are thousands of people in this country who are looking for work who are frozen out of the workforce by these artificially high rates. So what I'd like to see from the government is more of a conversation about how we can get people who are unemployed at the moment and extend to them the chance to have the dignity of work. And frankly, union bashing, it's a case of diminishing returns. It won't... Certainly it's diminishing returns in terms of its political punch, but also it won't really solve the structural problems at the heart of our industrial relations system.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that does get brought up at Parliament. Moving on to another topic now, and a Chinese spy has offered intelligence to ASIO and is now seeking asylum in Australia. Gideon, there have been some serious accusations of espionage. How will this impact relations with China?
Look, I suspect relations with China will take a hit, but this is the way things have been heading for a very long time. We know the Chinese engage in espionage when it comes to Australia, and it is the world of spying, and every country on earth engages in it to some level. But the way in which the Chinese have been interfering with Australia, including staging a cyber attack on our parliament on the eve of an election, show that Australia is not maybe a very important trading partner of Australia, but isn't necessarily the best friend of Australia. And at some point, we have to face up to the fact that not that China's an enemy of Australia necessarily, but it is increasingly a strategic rival. Whether you look at unprecedented levels of espionage, when you look at increasing belligerence and militarisation of the South China Sea, when you look at irreconcilable differences between Australia and China in relation to China's human rights record. And when you look at what's happening in Hong Kong or Taiwan, or especially the war crimes being committed against the Uyghur population in Western China right now, I don't think these are things that the West can afford to ignore anymore. So I think this is just yet another thing that will put a strain on the relations between Australia and China. It's a shame, but I think in a lot of ways it's irreversible given the modus operandi of the Communist Party.
It's certainly been on thin ice, that relationship, for a while now, and it seems to be heading in the wrong direction. Ben, Josh Frydenberg has labelled the accusations as disturbing. How will Australia respond to the accusations?
Well, in some ways, I don't think the accusations are new. Governments are always spying on each other. The Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, the Brits, they've all got spies here. The big thing, of course, is the defection. And it's a much different reaction to this official than when Chen Yongling tried to defect a number of years ago. He was a diplomat, potentially not a spy at this level. So the really big news is that the gentleman is seeking to defect, and it is a huge deal. Noted China has rejected his allegations, but this is going to have some serious diplomatic consequences for the Australia-Chinese relationship, which is already at a rather testy level. How different it is compared to when previous parliaments on John Howard had the President of China address both houses of Parliament and lock out senators, trampling on, illegally I might add, and trampling on democracy. China's had a terrible human rights record for a long time. The Uyghur population has been oppressed for a long time, the Uyghur population that Gideon mentioned, but the Tibetans have been oppressed. There's cultural genocide been going on a long time there. But the rise of China is happening. Australia is going to have to deal with it. And I think it's time, at the same time, the US is kind of vacating the field. And that moral leadership role it used to play, the championing of a rule-based order, the now unpredictability of Trump and US foreign policy, all leads to the need for Australia to wake up and have a more independent and robust foreign policy, put more effort into diplomacy. We've been under-resourcing that. Put more effort into overseas aid. We've been under-resourcing that. And this is the time where Australia needs to chart a new and more independent foreign policy, free of China, free of the United States, and chart our own course more. But that takes resources, tact, diplomacy, and I think that's the bigger picture debate that Australia needs to have.
Okay, so very quickly to wrap this topic up from both of you, we'll start with you, Gideon. Do you think the spy should be granted political asylum in Australia?
Yes, I do, absolutely.
And Ben?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll look on to another topic now. And of course, it is about Robo Debt. It's been a big topic that we have been covering this week. The government is set to abandon its key part of its so-called Robo Debt scheme. Ben, why was the scheme so controversial?
Well, it sought to basically make a guess based on income averaging of people's debt, and the government put a lot of resources into it, spent a lot of money on it, said that they're going to save a lot of money with it in the long term, underwrote a lot of their election promises in previous elections, saying we're going to have this extra money, we're going to be able to spend it on other people. But all the time, the legal basis of the scheme was unsound, and a lot of people were getting debt notices that weren't accurate. And, you know, hundreds of thousands of people may have been given essentially the wrong information. And I think it actually points to a bigger issue that needs looking at. The Australia Institute launched a new Centre for Responsible Technology this week, because technology and the use of it by governments, by corporations, digital technology, is running ahead of where the public is at and where the public interest is at. And this is a good example of it. And governments, corporations, individuals all need to take a better look at how digital technology is being used, whether it's personal information being hoovered up by big tech companies, whether it's fake news, or whether it's these robo debt systems being used by the government. Digital technology is running ahead of regulation and running ahead of the people and what's good for them. And this is a wake-up call for that bigger debate as well.
Gideon, why do you think the government has decided to halt a key part of the scheme?
Well, because it was an unmitigated disaster. And look, a lot of the criticism on Robo Debt has been coming from the left, for, I guess, obvious reasons, because it does involve people who, it's an issue that tends to be more championed by the left, which is the needs of Newstart recipients. But I think we on the right need to start talking about this as well, because it actually represents a gross betrayal of potentially thousands of Australian citizens. As Ben said, what the government has done is taken an algorithm to determine overpaid Newstart outlays and other government payments based on averaging incomes with an extraordinary rate of error, sent potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of welfare recipients information about them needing to pay back money erroneously, and has had terrible financial consequences on them. I think this is an important issue of government incompetence, affecting, frankly, some of our most vulnerable people. So if we do value the rule of law, if we do value property rights, and if we do value small government, then we have to talk about the way in which innocent people were given debts that were created out of thin air to prop up the government surplus. Now, nobody wants budget repair more than I do. Nobody wants lowering spending more than I do. But this is not genuine austerity. This is inventing, in a lot of cases, debts that didn't exist and hitting vulnerable people with them. And I think that more needs to be done to shut down this program and do it immediately.
OK, guys, we're going to try and squeeze in one more topic quickly before the buzzer goes. Labor leader Anthony Albanese has used his second vision speech to focus on his productivity plan. Gideon, what did you think of his latest vision?
Look, I think it was more of the same. I think Anthony Albanese knows he has a political problem and he needs to entire books can literally be written on Labor's falling out with its working class base and its need to reconnect to what we call aspirational voters in outer suburbs and regional areas. The problem is Labor tries to have a bob each way. They say, yes, we support aspiration, but we also want a progressive taxation system. Yes, we support free speech and we think political correctness has gone too far, but we absolutely need laws against hate speech. I think what Albanese is trying to do is give a little bit of a nip and tuck to Labor policy when it actually needs a full-on facelift, if not a facial transplant. So more is needed to be done by Anthony Albanese to get back in the electoral game here.
Harsh words there, Gideon. But Ben, Peter Dutton also said some harsh words. He said that Mr Albanese is a bigger threat than Bill Shorten. How accurate do you think that is?
Well, time will tell. It is a hard road back from an election shock that many in Labor weren't expecting to take, and that's a difficult position for Albo to be in. I think two things going on here. One, he's trying to make the government the issue. That's been one of his key themes since the election win. Hang on, stop talking about Labor, because I think that's something that did happen in the election campaign. It became kind of the de facto government in waiting. Whereas we actually have a real government that's been in for 6 years, and by the next election will be 9 years. So I think that his main task is continue to try and make the government the issue, not Labor the issue, and I think he's succeeding somewhat in that. That speech, that economic speech, I thought was good and interesting. The productivity agenda is a progressive agenda, and if we're going to lift productivity in Australia, it's going to take some government action. One of the best ways of lifting productivity is investing in childcare and increasing the female participation rate. Education, research and development, productivity and enhancing infrastructure. Those are roles that the government can play to lift productivity, and lifting productivity is a progressive agenda, and I thought that's an interesting speech from the opposition leader.
All right, guys, I think we did a pretty good job of trying to get through as many topics as we could this afternoon. Thank you both for your time.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Thanks, Gideon.
Coming up after the break, all the sport with Daniel.